I would like to introduce Matthew Skjonsberg. Dr. Matthew Skjonsberg is Director of Operations at Future Cities Laboratory, which is a new initiative whose varied research programs address sustainable landscapes and settlement systems in Switzerland and Singapore. And he's lecturer in civic design and program coordinator for the doctoral program of the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies in Zurich. And he will be giving a lecture entitled The Etymology of Design. Matthew, the Zoom platform is yours.
Thank you kindly. Well, it's really an honor to join you all. And at the risk of being a little bit digressive, even given the short time, I'm going to make use of the opportunity to give a little resume of how, in 15 slides, this current work we're doing came to be. So I picked up my first skateboarding magazine at the age of 12, July 1986. On the cover was this fantastic Jesse Martinez photograph. And at the last page of the magazine, they always have a section they called Something Else. And this was always a photograph or a short story or a drawing, something interesting. And in this case, it was a short story about a skateboarder who lost their life in an unrelated way. And being a generous spirit, they donated their organs to science. And a woman got his eyes, and she couldn't understand why when she goes around the city, her eyes would be going up the wall and down the stairs and over the bench, you know. So this is a little bit about, if you change the eyes, you change the animal. So this is how we see the world. This is a little bit about that. 10 years later, I published my first essay the year before going to architecture school, and it was published in Thrasher magazine. And the essay I wrote was about the new school of the Midwest in Chicago and Minneapolis. At that time, this was beginning to be talked about in skateboarding circles, that this was a new school emerging. And I found it very interesting that Frank Lloyd Wright had had the similar experience about 100 years earlier. And everybody was talking about the new school of the Middle West. And he said, maybe it's being talked about now, maybe someday it will be real. So I closed the essay with a quote from Wright saying, I know with what suspicion the person is regarded who refers matters of fine art back to nature. But any person who has individuality, and what person lacks it, has a right in some degree to expression of that individuality in their own environment. So this is the ethos that I imbibed. 10 years later, I was lucky enough to have my design for one of the early skate parks on the cover of Thrasher. So this is a little bit about 10-year cycles in our own lives. A few years later, this became the first case study about this kind of architectural subject in the architectural graphics standards. For those of you who are here, German-speaking Europeans, you'll know the Neufert as a kind of rough equivalent. But this was interesting because it was showing both an acceptance on the skateboarding side, on the professional side. I found a niche, as it were, based on how I saw the world. And this was really exciting because basically it brings us to the question of design. So now I skipped through some images here quickly, but to give you an idea, this is rainwater collection. Rainwater collection through here. This is the low point. We use irrigation then to irrigate the whole system. We have big investment in these 4 trees to have shade in the summertime microclimate design. It's acoustic buffer because it's building up, it's a cut and fill here. So you have also thermodynamic design. This kind of section detail gives the impression. So the storyline was the yellow path is the grandma path. That's where grandma can go without being afraid of being hit by a skateboard. She can be part of it. They had asked us to put a fence around this entire skate park. This is a more design development level. You see the site starts out as pretty flat here. It's about a 2% slope all the way across. And we did a cut and fill. And here, this was very gratifying to have the image. When I was taking this photo, I was really happy because I didn't know how it would be with the contractors, if they would have managed to do what I was hoping based on my calculations, that you see the mountains, but you don't see the houses. Why? Because that's the acoustic buffer of this hill. I was very happy to see the communication. So on the other hand, they had asked us to put a fence around the entire skate park. So it would have been a 4-meter fence with security cameras and the whole bit. And I sat with the city attorney and I said, you want this fence for security reasons, right? For liability reasons. But what happens if someone climbs over the fence and they get hurt and they can't get out because there's a fence? And so nobody can help them because there's a fence. Is someone really watching those security cameras all the time? And he agreed with me. He said, no, that's true. We're increasing our liability with this fence. It's a death trap. So we could take that budget and put it into lights, as you see here. Even the rainbow is real. It's not Photoshop. This is a happy image to show how, with this kind of intervention, we can bring our eyes to a project and make a more community-like atmosphere rather than a prison-like one. So just a few quick images, impressions, some studies about the location of the trees in the 3D model, the construction process, you get an idea. So here the pipe itself becomes like a periscope. You see, if you're sitting in the public library here and you see through the periscope, you have the view of the mountain beyond, framed in a very beautiful way. And just for the sake of completeness about this illustration, I show you a little bit of a connection here. So these are the things we do when we have a weekend, to have a few minutes. We can check out who's living in this park, who uses it every day, how is it being documented, what kind of community is it supporting. And here, this particular line gives the idea how the skate park was designed. It's momentum, it's microclimate, it's water collection, it's acoustics. This is thermodynamic design. So you see a couple little pushes here and there, and the rider can use the momentum from what's going on the sides to keep going the whole time. So this is a little bit about design. But now if we see the movement coming, how these riders move in the space is really coming from something we know all about, the meander logic. The logic, as we see here in Fisk's beautiful drawing, 1944. One of many drawings cataloging the entire Mississippi River Valley, where we see each of the historic riverbeds given in a different color. So this informs this kind of logic of and acknowledging the river itself is a ghostwriter. This is a quote from Aldo Leopold. He says, the river is a ghostwriter. Every spring, there's a new library of information about what's happening upriver. So this is a nature study paradigm, we can say. So we apply these logics to urban riverfront projects like in Danube, in Budapest, for example, here, or to the skate parks designs as we deal with, like in this case, for Madrid. So 56 of these skate parks have been built. So why I start with this, give it a 5-minute digression for the beginning. I think it's important to recognize our ambition is community, is design. And when we say we mean a bigger group. We have this fantastic collective effort with the Vademecum to bring 77 minor terms for writing urban places. So those the three terms that I was involved with contributing are going to be addressed in this lecture in the context of introducing some other terms as well. So civic design is the first, nature study is the second, and new natures, or what I would call personally second nature. This was a contribution shared with Saskia de Witt. We combined our thinking about that. But this integration of narratives for me involves the etymology of design. So we jump in. The etymology of design, according to Kostas Terzidis, involves something very surprising, very exciting. I think we're lucky when we have Greek colleagues because we can get such fantastic etymological lessons. And in this case, as he explains in the beautiful text, the etymology of design of pre-Socratic perspective, it's coming from the terms eshin, coming from eho, it's the past tense, coming from shido, it means something that we had but don't have anymore. So design is more about memory than it is about invention. So it's literally about making a sign that points to an existing relationship that's been neglected or forgotten, and we bring attention to that. So design is about memory. Okay, so that immediately brings us to this question of aesthetics. What is aesthetics about? Well, it turns from the asthenomē or aesthesis from the Greek. It's talking about the cumulative input of all of our senses. So not just the 5 senses of our anatomical structure, but also our sense of balance, also our sense of right and wrong. So the ethics are really implicit in aesthetics. So with the doctoral program we're responsible for here now, we are developing a view that's between urban studies on one hand, and so here you see a rural urban condition, sort of an edge conditions intersection, and we have civic design, which is taking a more infrared view, talking about more dynamics, about more bottom up, whereas urban design is more about top down. And the key word here is landscape. So what is landscape? Well, from a historic perspective, the etymology of landscape is also related to the intention of, in the English language, some of the early people to adopt the term, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, who described that landscape is two layers. It's the ecological armature of the region, the riverways, the steep slopes, and the really high quality soils. That becomes a via negativa figure in the region, a territorial figure, as Paula Vigano would say, where it's where not to build, where as via negativa. So basically that's the ecological armature of the region based on the watershed. And it is superimposed with the dual network, the second network of infrastructure. So infrastructure and ecology, that's the armature for landscape. This is coming from the tradition of practice. So we try to see these bottom up and top down in a similar way. It's like culture on the left and nature on the right. You have this nature culture paradigm. So as we talk about this, I want to problematize a little bit our framing of urban places. What is urban? You know, this is a very real discourse that's unfolding now between my current efforts with the book and exhibition Living Cities, which we're preparing. We had last year at the EPFL, and we're preparing next year for the British Library and for the book catalog to be published. That'll be 30 cities looking at the history of park systems. But at the same time, there are two other exhibitions closely related to which I've been involved to some degree, taking the countryside of Sebastian Marot and Countryside, the Future of Rem Koolhaas and his team, which was also involving Sebastian and our exchanges. So I share these three, who, if you're interested, you can take a screenshot and follow up on them. But in relation to what we've discussed already, I think it's relevant to point out when we had the exhibition in Lausanne, the highlight of my academic career until now was these weekend workshops we had with school children from the neighborhood, 8 to 12 years old. And we walked them along the river on the campus, walked them through the exhibition, and then we gave them a model of the city. And we asked them to make a little park model, how they get from their house on their skateboard to grandma's house, take grandma in the wheelchair, take grandma to the lake on the wheelchair, and then come back home and visit some friends on the way. So each of the 15 children had their own circuit in the city. Now, this is a simple exercise that's very practical. What I did not expect was that in the afternoon, it wasn't the parents who came to pick up most of these kids, it was the grandparents. And there was literally a grandmother in a wheelchair with a tear coming down her cheek saying to me, "It's so beautiful that you thought of us." And this is the storyline, this intergenerational storyline of mobility through natural corridors in the city. So even a place like Lausanne, if you've been, you might know the place called Vallée de la Genèse, which is a park that was established in '64. But underneath that park was this beautiful cascading terrace, natural riverway, and it was buried with 7 meters of fill, and they covered it with flowers and children. And this is a kind of fig leaf to cover the nakedness of certain industrial ambitions, we can say, and how consistently we see ecological functionality usurped by a certain infrastructural prerogative of maybe we can say technological determinism. So what we want is a little bit to bring the counter argument, environmental determinism. This is also equally relevant, we think. So is it possible to get beyond rural and urban? So as such, dualism as a binary logic is considered to be the enemy of progressive thought, but you find a lot of texts saying beyond nature and culture, beyond rural and urban, but is it really true? So this is a reflection, Deleuze and Guattari, right, in Rhizome, one does not escape binaryism, for such dyads are the basic elements of power. And I think it's worth to just take a minute to read this full quote. So many dualisms, so many sets of opposing categories, whether we say nature, culture, rural, urban, it might seem odd when the enemy is supposed to include above all binary logic. But this is a trap, since after all, how could one ever escape the logic of oppositions? How could one think without drawing distinctions? Hence, the real question is one of tactics. Above all, it is not a matter of eschewing dichotomies. It is rather a matter of how they are treated. None of these oppositions can be taken as fixed. None should be regarded as drawing a line which must be defended at all costs. Philosophy is not a war of positions. It's a war of movement. Oppositions are therefore necessary, but only as staging points. Nothing is sacred, not science, nor even ideology. That's from Paul Patton's Reflections upon Deleuze-Guattari's Reflections. So here we go deep a little bit. Ruralization, what does it mean? It's a term coined by Cerda about 1860. It refers to a process. When you speak with people about urbanization, often their reflex is to say, oh, I'm coming from Cerda, and I know Cerda. Well, Cerda's last book has never been translated into any other language. It was called Ruralization. So his basic argument was you should ruralize the urban and urbanize the rural. And this is some fundamental logic that I think we need to revisit. We're working now to develop a translation of this text with the GTA here. Ruralism is a term coined by Miss Humphrey Ward in 1894, taken up by Liberty Hyde Bailey, a professor at Cornell, and popularized by such as Anna Comstock, also at Cornell, Frederick Law Olmsted, Patrick Geddes, and Frank Lloyd Wright. It refers to an agenda. Nature study is the term used by these figures and others, including Evelyn and John Dewey, William James, and their colleagues at the University of Chicago, who self-identified as the ecological school, and it refers to a method. So here we have these key protagonists of ruralism, three dead white men who we think we know very well. Well, it turns out they didn't correspond with one another. We don't have any evidence of their direct exchange in their lifetimes, but everyone they worked with was communicating with each other. So you have this whole field of relations between these three figures. And behind that whole field of relations, men, women, transsexuals, we got a whole inventory we can get into. We have what I refer to as the new school of nonlinear design. So this is a pedagogical school. Just to give a brief overview of how we come to these people. Pestalozzi, we know, is exiled a family from northern Italy. They arrive in Zurich. He develops the method of teaching he calls teaching by head and heart and hand. His protege is Friedrich Froebel. Froebel conceives of the kindergarten and simplifies the story by saying it's learning by doing. So Froebel's great protege is Margarita Schertz, and she goes to London and starts the first kindergarten in London in 1851. Froebel dies in 1853, and in 1855, Margarita Schertz marries her sweetheart and comes to Wisconsin, my home state, where she founds the first kindergarten in the United States. And among her first students were Frank Lloyd Wright's mother and her two sisters. So these three sisters, the Lloyd Jones sisters, established the school that became the school that I studied at, Taliesin. And if you visit the campus there, you find still this beautiful homage to the aunts, to Aunt Nell and Aunt Jane, the Lloyd Jones sisters, founders of these buildings in 1886. So these were the first projects of Wright. It was made in a context of a new education, as they called it. Here we have this incredible portrait of Wright's mother on the right and her two sisters, Nell and Jane, on the left. So what an epic portrait. We can take some inspiration from the character of these women, of course. And the idea they found themselves involved with was, as they described it themselves, the new education, the nature study idea. So Liberty Hyde Bailey, who I mentioned at Cornell, wrote this rural outlook set. And the outlook to nature, the nature study idea, the state and the farmer, the country life movement. This is all, I think, a very healthy antidote to our tendency towards urban agendas at this time, where urbanites tend to conceive of rural inhabitants as peasants living in a hinterland and project their idea onto them that what they need to be is more urban, more like us, you know? Well, this is very questionable. So I think what we're talking about here is rural agency. So this is, I know, a key word for many of our colleagues. Geddes again talks about civics as applied sociology and develops this deliberately dialectic, dualistic rural-urban discourse. Here we have the view of Getty's Outlook Tower from the countryside, a beautiful image from the archives there. And here we have a solar image showing Outlook Tower in silhouette across the year as well. This is suggestive of the Valley section. This is a kind of environmental determinism from Geddes, talking about a variety of occupations, a variety of settlement types. We're not talking only rural, we're talking about regional, civic connectivity between rural and urban at the scale of the watershed. And of course, this impossibly relevant diagram that shows up in his 1915 text already, showing the expansive outward pressures of the city and the reciprocal force of the countryside pushing back. So you get this wonderful articulated edge condition that really shows a lot about, I think, where we're talking about rural-urban relations now. But even if we talk about something like climate change, we should be aware it's not a new subject. Since 1847, it's been discussed, and we have a variety of examples. But these were discourses happening among farmers, among rural inhabitants. They were concerned about climate change and human-induced climate change and the negative effects of that. So I'll wrap up in the next minute here with just a few slides showing this is the last page of Patrick Getty's last sketchbook, which were put into the hands of Jacqueline Tyrwhitt. It's not even in his archive. He writes Nature Study. Here he writes beautifully, Nature Study, Growing Consciousness of Water, Vegetable Kingdom, Animal Kingdom, etc. So this is what was on his mind at the end of his life. We think it's a new paradigm, but in fact, it's not such a new paradigm. What we talk about, this environmental determinism agenda, still has a place that needs to be rediscovered after about 50 years of deliberately being put to the side. Just to conclude with some images from John and Evelyn Dewey's book, Schools of Tomorrow, An Hour a Day Spent in the Gym, It's Climbing Trees, The Gully is a Favorite Textbook, Real Gardens for City Nature Study. And as a kind of epitome of this logic, the folding in of the school right design for the Avery Coonley Progressive School, the garden designed by Jens Jensen, and the neighborhood designed by Olmsted. This is the Riverside neighborhood. So we will end, I think, here to say, I think we have our work cut out for us to understand the terminology we're using, not to get sucked into a new urban agenda, which is pretty myopic enthusiasm for urbanization, but understand when we say urban, what do we mean? To conclude, urbanization is the term coined by Cerda about 1860. It refers to a process. Urbanism with an E, the French term coined by about 1910, popularized by Le Corbusier and his colleagues, refers to an agenda. And urbanism, the Americanized term, popularized in the 1950s by such institutions as the Rockefeller Foundation, it refers to a corporate agenda. So, and this is my interpretation of urbanism to date, is it's largely a rebranding of colonialism. Just to underline the point, if you take an exchange of various scholars and what they define as urban, we know it's a very heterogeneous definition. So, but if you map those terms onto a landscape, then what you see as an agglomeration, as a figure, is finally in the center here, the river valley, the mountain peaks. So let's get the rural urban agenda in hand and think about the scale of the watershed as the basis for our planning. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you very much, Matthew, indeed, for this very interesting talk that shows us very, very different types of integration, of nature into design, design into nature, and vice versa. Thank you for juxtaposing these notions of what is rural and what is urban. I would like to invite everyone to take part in this Q&A session that is to follow. Please, if you have thoughts, questions, comments, ideas, please signal me directly or Angeliki in the chat, or Willie even, and we will invite you to say something. I would like to hereby open the discussion. Do we have any questions, comments, ideas?
The classic awkwardness of the beginning, but somebody should break the awkwardness.
Well, I don't know why, if it should always be me, so I try to be wait a little bit, but I do have, I do want to support Sonia in indeed thanking Matthew for broadening the concept of integration. I mean, we've spoken about integration very much in social terms and thinking how we could come up with urban strategies that include different user groups, and we've spoken about this polyvocality and different voices and so on. And here comes Matthew bringing in the rural and the landscape and the memory and the watershed. And I think that is really, really crucial indeed, that integration is not only happening on a social level, but as much on a spatial level. And there are even hidden or more or less hidden parts of our landscapes and our cities that we don't necessarily immediately understand from the map, such as the water, the watersheds, or the terraces that you showed in your other example. So I think that was very beautiful, and also appreciated your introduction about the skate parks, and thinking of them not only as places for youth, but actually as intergenerational places with different routes and different levels of accessibility, where the landscape, the water, the public space, and these spaces of encounter were somehow all coming together. So I thought it was very, very inspiring. Thank you, Matthew.
It's a pleasure. I do think this this connection between rural and urban is exactly this theme of civic design. You talk about social dimensions in urban design. I think this is exactly what the civic can do, is bridge rural and urban in this way through landscape. So where the landscape armature that we were describing, that's the regional scale armature, is imbued with those institutions and places and museums, schools. This is historically what was the case, and I think it's a strong model for the future with a performance record that we can track and build on with our scholarly efforts.
I think Saskia was speaking in one of the earlier sessions about urban places as urban landscapes, and I think when we're discussing these medium-sized cities that are indeed maybe not countryside, not the metropolis, but something in between, that there is this aspect of the landscape and how the landscape defined urban form, and how landscape also can give us clues for more integrative forms of design might be a very important aspect not to overlook.
I think, yeah, and just as you say, I think there's always the danger with certain systematic approaches that we have also over-integration or over-connectivity. We need healthy boundaries at certain moments as well. So I find this idea of rural-urban very helpful, because it allows meaningful distinctions to be made between what kind of activities are happening. And at the same time, there's a lot of overlap for, you know, fitting things together. But there is a kind of, especially a moment in the landscape where we have these intersections of overpasses and riverways. And these Xings, I think, become a very interesting point of focus for our civic design efforts, for example, because they really are exactly those moments where we can say in a general way, culture and nature and rural and urban are combining and intersecting. And yeah, it's like valves, like a heart valve. You wouldn't just put the whole thing together and say, oh, it'll sort itself out. No, you have to give it some structure, the heart as well as the city.
I have a question.
Completely. Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, please do. Please, yes.
I'm sorry. I just saw the end of your presentation, but what I saw, I thought it was very, very interesting. But I'm sorry about that. But in one of the slides, I think I read that you were making a parallel between urbanism and colonialism.
Yes.
If I'm right. So in that sense, I don't know if you talked about it or not, but I would like for you to talk a little bit more about that, but also about do-it-yourself urbanism. How does, because we in the session previous to this one, there was a very important question made by Sernat, that she was asking, to whom are these spaces? To whom?
Yes.
So if you could expand on this.
Yes. So the second question was about do-it-yourself, and the first question was, again, can you say again?
Urbanism as colonialism. And in that sense, how the do-it-yourself urbanism or the pop-up urbanism is colonialism.
Well, okay, so I think the term urban became an omnibus for all kinds of unexplicit interests. So we have a moment in 1953 following the war where Rockefeller Foundation goes to Siegfried Gideon, who is teaching civic design at MIT, and they gave him a lot of money. And they say, please stop talking about civic design with its emphasis on ecology and community. We've got a new theme for you. It's called urban design. So as far as I can tell in my research, the term urban design was coined by the Rockefeller Foundation. to displace civic design. So that was 53. 54, they go to Cert at Harvard, and they give him the same storyline, and he kills the civic design program that had been founded by Olmsted Jr. in 1910. And he says, our sponsors, the public statement he made is, our sponsors prefer we avoid use of the term civic design. So that's the beginning of the urban design program at Harvard. In 55, they went to Jane Jacobs at Columbia. And in 56, they go to Kevin Lynch. So Kevin Lynch came from my school. He came from Taliesin and had been working with Frank Lloyd Wright on the Broadacre City Project, which became the heart of the Horizontal Metropolis initiative that we developed with Bernardo Secchi and Paola Vigano over the last years. So there's a deep story about this displacing of the civic by the urban. So that's just 4 examples I can give you, but it goes on. It's a very deep storyline, but you get the idea that basically it also relates to the last question you asked. And I'll take the liberty here just to share screen briefly, because you asked about do-it-yourself urbanism. So when I was asked by the Rockefeller Foundation in the guise of the MoMA, of Museum of Modern Art, to be a guest curator at MoMA for this exhibition about Frank Lloyd Wright, I made it the theme of my essay. I called it Do It Yourself. I called it From Individual Sovereignty to Civic Design. And the editors there retitled it Do It Yourself, Usonian Automatic System. Okay, fair enough. But what came here is an elaboration of this idea, most can raise the flowers now, for all have got the seeds. So to what degree is it really possible, meaningful do-it-yourself? So my argument in a nutshell is, giving certain precedents and examples, is to show how a certain system called Usonian Automatic was able to be developed by Wright for individual do-it-yourself construction of individual houses. This is a family house, the Tompkins House in Seattle, but it also became the basis for Florida Southern College, where the students built their own campus at the scale of a real urban district. It's a pretty incredible example where basically, yeah, you get the systems here. Wright was going from prefabricated systems, a logic of how you could get the benefit of factory construction in the 1915s, to a kind of craftsmanship model. He was concerned about integrating craftspeople. So that was in the 30s after the Depression, when construction was cheap. And then finally, this is the do-it-yourself system with 12 details, with 12 different blocks. You can make your own house. So this is an example of that house. Well, you can also do your own campus, like it was shown here. So I think when we have a robust landscape armature that's mediating rural and urban in the way we're talking about civic mediation, we have a lot more flexibility to experiment, to try things, because the armature will be intact. So we can have intergenerational continuity in infrastructure, which is, as we know, 1/2 of landscape is infrastructure, according to the people who form the practice. So this is, I think, the key, in a way, to get beyond the colonial phase of urbanization, where it tends to be an omnibus. I mean, look at MIT today, you have the MasterCard Center for Advanced Urbanism. I mean, talk about military, industrial, finance, industry complicity. We're pretty much at the heart of the matter. And this is, yeah, for me, a sort of overview. I hope it's helpful in response to your questions. Thank you. You're still muted.
Excuse me, sorry. Thank you very much, Matthew. Saskia had a question, so.
Yes, hi Matthew. I really liked your talk. You addressed a lot of different topics, and so one of the things that I would like you to go a bit deeper into is that you mentioned, and actually you almost answered it right now, but not completely. You said that you cannot escape dualism, and that kind of links back to what we discussed this morning, that you cannot talk about meaning without oppositions, because something only gets a meaning if you can oppose it to something else to give it understanding. But we also talked about this subject in terms of power. So, and you said, well, okay, we have dualisms, we have urban, we have rural. You also talked about urbanism in relation to colonialism. That already talks about this a little bit. there's always the kind of the ones in power and the other ones, the lesser ones. So, and the way you talked about a kind of ideal idea about rural versus urban, where they have the same power almost, that's the ideal state, which of course isn't the case. So how do you think about this kind of difference in power?
Well, I think Switzerland is a good example. You have a lot of initiatives at the ETH here over the years to assert a kind of urban hegemony. So urbanists going into the countryside saying the peasants in the hinterland, they have their, place we can make space for them, Well, Swiss people aren't having it. They're allergic to this kind of elite attitude. So in Switzerland, it's not possible to maintain that attitude. So I'm really thankful. I got recruited to come to the ETH and engage with this community, with their biases, and allow those biases to be on board. Because if you're talking about a number of population, yes, Zurich has a very political hegemony in a certain way in Switzerland, because it is the urban center. But politically, it may feel that way and behave that way. But in fact, on a political level, there's already a big constituency that is very rural in Switzerland. And I think in many places we'll find that's the case. So finally, what we're talking about is, I think, using our skills as designers and as writers. We need to be something between a journalist and a geometrician, and we work between illusion and public policy. We have this kind of role to facilitate agency. So basically, you ask how. For me, the big vision here is we're creating a project called the 5 Swiss Watersheds. First of all, because every time you say to somebody the 5 Swiss watersheds, they say, oh, there's only 4 watersheds in Switzerland. And that's the point. There's a 5th, and it's the small one. It's 0.3% of the area of Switzerland. It's 0.4% of the language groups. Each of the major rivers in Switzerland has its own language group, right? And they're proportional, as it turns out, to the footprint, the watershed of those rivers. So that's very incredible. So now, within 5 years, we will have these glaciers that feed these rivers will be gone. So it's a very strange time. We don't know. Now these rivers become seasonal. The lake becomes a third as deep. We don't know. It's going to be a big experiment in human lives and in other ecological lives. But we know within 5 years, we can actively engage with the smallest community of the smallest watershed. And that's the Romanish native, basically the indigenous people of Switzerland. And our ambition is, by developing a working program, starting with oral history of this region and of these people, allowing them to speak for themselves, giving them a platform, using the ETH as a kind of loudspeaker to give a platform to these neglected people, the indigenous people of Switzerland. And we hope that in some modest but meaningful way, we can also thereby give an example for other indigenous people who don't necessarily have these Swiss advantages. And in this way, really actively engage with, just as you say, bringing about in a kind of agency-based way, the need for the role of minorities in these exchanges, and championing that, especially championing this idea that the rural traditions and artifacts and cultures are of equal interest to the urban artifacts and traditions. This is kind of a 2-step civilization move we do, it seems. If everybody goes to one side of the boat, then you can't steer it anymore. So you need to get a little bit, okay, rural, urban, there we go. Okay, now we can steer. It's okay. Sometimes it'll be 80-20, sometimes it'll be 20-80. You have this kind of thresholds. But I hope that answers your question. This is a practical project, the 5 Swiss Watersheds project, that we will be using in the next 5 years through this Future Cities Laboratory.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Are there any more comments, thoughts, ideas? They say it's polite to wait 7 seconds. If there are no responses, then we can move on. Actually, it is time for us to move towards our short statements and responses, 5 minutes each. And if you are all okay with it, I would like to introduce our first statement giver. This is Michael G. Kelly from the University of Limerick. Michael, the Zoom platform is yours.
Excuse me. Thanks very much, Sonia. I'm aware of a kind of a congenital tendency to run over time on my part, so please just shout if things start to get out of hand, okay? I'm going to share an embarrassingly basic PowerPoint presentation with you, which is actually just my title, because it's really on these terms that I want to try to zero in the brief time I have. My contribution is essentially a response to the if you like, the precautions it felt necessary to take in relation to the word integration, because very often in cultural discussions, the topic of integration, the term of integration, is one that produces a kind of an ambivalent response. And I wanted to do it specifically in terms of my own perspective, or the perspective I think I bring to this network as somebody who works on literature and on texts, and to ask myself maybe in a more focused way than would normally be the case, what is it specifically about the textual dimension of our discussions that allows one to expand an understanding of integration, or what integration might be in terms of our collective exchanges. So in a way, I'm going to engage in another binary. There, as Matthew said, binaries are a kind of a necessary evil. One resists them, and at the same time, one is inevitably drawn into them as structuring, if you like, features of the landscape. And mine would be between reality and representation. And of course, that can immediately be taken apart, but my focus here is much more roundly on the representational or representation related element of the binary than on realities per se, and in particular realized material realities, which is a key focus of our architectural and urbanistic colleagues. So in terms of representation, and in specifically, because this is a resolutely non-visual presentation, my focus here is on words and on the way they interact. In terms of representation, verbal, written representations, how might one think integration in an expansive and at the same time non-threatening way? It seems to me that there are a few terms here which could help us out. The first one is that very basic one of utterance. What does it mean, in a sense, to think of the text as an utterance that integrates its the terms it brings together? One can see this as a metaphor for the urbanization process, for the urban experience, in a sense, that when individual terms are brought together in an utterance, itself reperformed through the acts of writing and reading, when one brings individual terms into an utterance, their meaning becomes co-defined, but also arguably, especially in terms of literary texts or creative texts, their meaning, their individual kind of established meanings are transformed. So are modified in some kind of an interesting way. The reason I mention this is because I think that when we're talking about writing, and we're talking about narratives, and we're talking about, in a sense, individualized textual productions, we need to bear in mind this transformative or potentially transformative dimension of what happens when we accede to language, when we begin to speak, when we begin to produce utterances. Now, the second point I'd make here, or the second development I'd like to emphasize, is the way in which, in a sense, literary form or different kinds of textual forms as they've been developed within literary practice engage in different kinds of integration. Okay, there's a typical kind of modernist text. It can take a novelistic form, it can take a poetic form, but which engages in processes of holding diverse elements together within a textual space. Okay, and one could say that that really relates to texts that are largely about space and the exploration of the textual space. There are others that are much more about this kind of integrative, transformative potential of the utterance. That is, in being drawn into the process of utterance, the elements are fused together in new ways and change their meaning, the meanings that they bring to the table, as it was before the utterance occurred. So these are different kinds of integration which can be thought in terms of the literary text. One might be, to use another term that was used earlier on, a kind of a bridging of the space between the different terms, but there are also these kinds of transformative or more alchemistic kind of views of what happens in the literary text or in the creative written text. Just an aside here, and 5 minutes isn't really a space in which one can make many asides, but I think it's very interesting and important, especially given the variety of approaches that we have here, to question whether, in a sense, writing urban place can or should be uniquely about narratives of one sort or another. There have been frequent references to writing one's story. Is one always writing one's story when one is writing, especially in this kind of urban context? There are all forms of inscription, all kinds of inscriptions, which are not necessarily fully fledged stories, but which at the same time beg the question of the way in which subjects write themselves into the urban space and into the urban experience. Now, there's one development of this kind of issue that I'd refer to very briefly is, on top of the utterance and on top of this idea of, if you like, produced language or the performed language, there is an attractively connected idea of the network, okay? The way in which different elements can be brought into a kind of a functional relationship and create new kinds of possibilities. And one interesting author on the topic of the network and on the city as a host to networks of different sorts is Antoine Picon, a French writer, who in a 2014 essay, La Ville des Réseaux, the city of networks, talks and makes a very important point that the network, whatever kind of network it be, while it has a material dimension, is also very much about a shared imaginary representation, and that the shared imaginary representation, whatever the diversity the network holds together, the shared imaginary representation is critical to its functioning as a network. So that's a kind of a text that can, or rather an idea that can apply to both textual representations, but also that the imaginary is critical here, but also to the kinds of manifestations of connectedness that we see in particular urban spaces. I conclude then, coming back to the question of literary form, and go back to a classical, if you like, iteration of this problem, which is Baudelaire's opening remarks to the Spleen de Paris. And then you can go back and consult them in your own time. But one of the key points he makes here is that the individual creative subject invents new forms as a response to the kind of shock of new urban experience. So what we have here in the question of literary form is a kind of a transferable, reiterable, scalable, or displaceable, if you like, construct, but which is, at least in literary terms, the fruit of an individual's attempt to assert their own creative agency in a new reality. And I think that in revisiting that question of form as both a literary challenge, but also as a space in which different kinds of integration can take place, we have a lot to gain in terms of our overall deliberations. Was that a deliberate cough, Sonia, or should I
Yes.
should I shut up? Okay, thank you. I'll
Thank
unshare.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Excellent. You gave us a lot to think about, and we are very, very anxious to hear Isabella Indolfi's response. Isabella, please correct me if I'm wrong. We have you as an independent curator here, and we very much look forward to your response on the topic of integration.
Thank you everyone. Yeah, I'm an independent curator and part of the working group 4. So talking about integration in the city, I would like to focus on the role of public art in the promotion of interculturality and hyperdiversity. Please note that these two words, interculturality and hyperdiversity, are borrowed from the 77 minor terms from the Vademecum, edited by some of our colleagues. And for hyperdiversity, we mean a complexity as well as a fluidity of social positions, senses of belonging and identities in the cities. And this match of narratives from the past and from the future creates the so-called interculturality, which is a synergy of plurality combined with the traditional narratives. So art, with its universal languages, with the possibility to experiment innovative ways of inclusion, can provide concrete tools and methods for the construction of common grounds among the communities. Art actually can implement intercultural dialogue that aims to reinforce social cohesion through the creation of bridges and links among people and communities. It's important that the art in public spaces to do this can use participatory strategies, and it should engage communities in active storytelling so that they can project their own identity in the environment. Of course, I'm speaking of a certain kind of art projects that dialogue with the context directly. So I would say site-specific or community-based projects. I will give you 2 samples of this kind of projects that have been selected in the pool of projects for Porto conference. The first one is Seminaria, which is a biennial festival of public art that takes place in a small medieval town and in the south of Italy, where I come from. And the community is small and the sense of belonging is strong. So every external intervention is very helpful to activate the awareness of being in the world. Through the artists, we implement a sensory community. This is another word borrowed from the Vademecum. And so we make this community aware of the stimuli that give shape to their experience. And we do this with a very simple tool, which is the artistic residency, which is the most effective tool that allows real exchange between the artists coming from outside and the hosting community. So this is the only way that the artists can develop site-specific projects for and with the local people. And of course, if the artist is sensitive enough, he or she will be able to find, emphasize, and enhance some aspect of the local culture so that the outsider gaze of the artist can help the community actually to recognize their own identity and to reenact it. The other project that I would like to present you in this very short time is ID project, Your City Identity. It's a project that aims to preserve oral histories. We know our cities are made of oral histories, also the narratives are made of this. So ID project uses QR codes technologies to create an emotional map of the city. So what this project does is investigate the plurality of identities around the world. And of course, we need the active participation of the people. So ID employs the QR codes on ceramic tiles and installs them to notable sites. Each of these QR codes hyperlinks the location to a capsule of memory containing a colloquial unique history told by a resident in a short video interview. So the content is are these interviews which become a sort of mini landmarks located all over the city. And in this way, through the creation of the so-called, again, from the Vademecum, converging media spaces, in other words, hybrid spaces integrating elements of urban space and media space. So this ID project, using this idea, augments physical spaces and enables the connection of both the physical and the virtual community, creating a new geography. So I think I ran out of the time, so thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Isabella, very much for this excellent presentation of the two projects. Please keep your questions for a bit later. We have one more statement from Juan Garcia Esparza. Juan, you will please help me how to pronounce the name of your university, Universidad?
Jaume I.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. I guess you can see.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, well, it's my presentation is about integration, and I'll be the quicker, the better. Well, following the definition, well, the introduction of Michael Kelly says that there exists, so there are different kind of integrations. Or my first question is, what integration do we desire, or what integration do we permit or even accommodate? Integration to me is behavioral. It's something, or it's a quality in the environment. It implies, as Michael mentioned, accepting, adapting, transforming, and well, not only the place but others, ideas and forms of expressions. And following a definition of arts integration, it might be the one that looks for increasing the knowledge of a general subject or in a specific area, looking for understanding or appreciating an integrated sense of these arts, right? I'll put it in the realm of my field of expertise, which is the heritage realm. Contemporarily, well, critical approaches to plural meanings of what heritage means are understanding different sorts of appropriation or appropriation of the space, looking for a more democratic calling processes or processes of selection or about what's important. This discourse now approaches the parallelisms or the integration between the pure logic of the tangible and together with the realm of the intangible, emotions, feelings, values, power, and justice even. So now this wide open perspective together with the no connotations of integration, is telling us that something bigger is happening. And for example, let's show this second one. Images like this perhaps, well, belong to a colonial legacy in terms of heritage preservation, where these cooling processes have somehow clashed with local realities since their inception, right? So heritage sites have often been creating several different processes that segregate both spaces and people and society, temporarily and even geographically, right? So, well, this is a kind of story of good and bad guys whom somehow are defining what prevails today, or what is defined as heritage today. So, next slide. Yeah, what we are achieving right now, it's more about understanding integration from a bottom-up approach. It's a theoretical discourse right now that integrates the weak, for example, or even integrates the spontaneous, the humble, and even the flamboyant, or I don't know, but integrates different perspectives, right, in the urban fabric. So this is pretty new, and this allows actors to coexist and cohabit these contemporary spaces, or contemporary historical even scenarios, right? Well, the problem of how these objects, places, or these landscapes are appreciated transcends the domains of the contemporary life, as well, Michael as well introduced in a previous well, kind of chat we had last week about the skaters and so on. But as I said, the problem of adequately engaging these past, this legacy, and present forms of transformation, or even meaningfulness, forms of legacy in the end need to confront the previous forms of methodological approaches. Concluding, because this is pretty short intervention. Non-official forms, as the ones that I've showed in the previous slide, non-official forms of heritage creation and preservation are now integrated, are resulting from complementary methods. From the one of the historian are those of ethnography, or those of oral history, and this somehow has moved or has frustrated historians, because this escapes their realm, and this poses, or this expels them from a new point of view, or from new approaches to the heritage discourse, the heritage creation, contemporary creation in the urban realm. I'm specifically referring to power, dominance, etc. I mean, that was the main idea I wanted to convey here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan. As a responder, we have Dace Bula from the University of Latvia.
Sorry.
Yeah, good afternoon once more. Am I heard well?
Yes, very nice.
Okay. Well, I'm concluding this session with this range of very diverse perspectives on integration, and very interesting ones. And I hope I will echo with some of the ideas expressed during this this session. I think the coast action in which we all participate provides a unique perspective on integration in that it invites to link the social and spatial dimensions of integration processes, tangible and intangible, as Juan Garcia just put it. And to ask, among other things, whether and how built environment and its particular objects encourage or vice versa preclude integrative moves, whether and how they produce conditions for or obstacles to integration, what are the connections between the fragmentation of physical and that of social space. What integration or separation narratives does the built environment transmit or inspire? And as a narrative scholar, I particularly appreciate this narrative vantage point on urban experience, since it allows for fruitful empirical and conceptual frames. Narrative inquiry can be used as a field method to approach the ways in which city dwellers construct the meanings of urban spaces, engage in symbolic appropriation acts, or experience social divides. And narrative approach also suggests to think of the idea of legibility of the physical world, or urban literacy as Klaske has it, the inclination of human mind to translate spatial encounters into narratives. As we know, the idea is present in a number of contemporary lines of thought in the concept of built narratives used in urban design studies, the concept of spatial stories met in cognitive science, the concept of storied matter coming from material eco-criticism, as well as post-humanist concept of discursivity of matter. And to proceed with the integration capacity of urban space, I will say something about my personal view on it in the context of this cost action. It is actually participation in this network that has encouraged a shift in my project on environmental experience narratives in the Riga port neighborhoods. I have modified or widened the initial focus to include people's engagement with the built environment. That has to do with all three concepts of this cost action and with integration in particular. Namely, I have become more and more interested in such built objects, very characteristic of my area of study of the Riga port territory as walls and fences, and their impact on urban experience and integration of urban space. And here I probably echo with some minor detail from Matthew's presentation, where he dealt with this fence around the skate park. Walls and fences are contemplated as objects that are both functionally and discursively influential, especially within border studies, and basically aimed at the fragmentation of space. They transmit multiple boundary messages, those of separation, demarcation, enclosure, gathering, protection, etc. And regardless on what grounds certain segments of urban fabric are set apart by walls or fences, be it ownership or type of activity or something else, these constructions exert discriminating effect on both physical and social space and deeply shape people's experience of urban environment. Dividing the space into insides and outsides, they create differential spatial regimes of accessibility, safety, passability, and visibility. And they also produce social discrepancies regarding authorization, entitlement, and belonging, or vice versa, exclusion and prohibition. And border narratives in themselves, walls and fences, are addressed in oral stories people tell, and they provide material surface for various kinds of graphic discursivity, including the inside-outside controversies in forms of graffiti and other. It's also customary that territories beside fences become zones for space appropriation debates and actions, and it's also a case in my study. So in my research, to conclude, I try to combine all these aspects of the narrativity of walls and fences. I treat fences surrounding the Riga port and cutting out 1/5 of the city territory from human access as storied matter in several senses. First, in the sense of a narrative subject appearing in the interviews of the residents, as they constitute really environmental problems. And I also consider the narrativity of these fences as constituted by their function, enforced or disputed by special forms of discourse, such as signposts, warnings, and graffiti. And I also look at symbolic activities of appropriation aimed at transforming the communicative character of these spatial objects in the search for